In this video, we're going to be doing some testing. And in order to do that, we need to make some changes to our directory structure. So inside my Mr. Terry H folder, which will probably be named different for you, I'm going to go into the framework folder and I'm going to create two folders. One called source, which is named src for short, and one called tests. And then we're going to drag these two folders that we've already been working on into the source folder. Okay, so now that's done, we need to just update this PSR4 autoloading, and then in our VM we need to run composer dump autoload. Perfect, so now let's just check we didn't break anything, which we didn't. Great. So the next thing that we need to do is install the php unit command. Now, inside our VM, if I run php unit, I get the list of commands as you'd expect, but you probably won't because it probably isn't installed for you. All you need to do is go to phpunit.de/gettingstarted.html, and that link will be in the description. And once you're here, you just need to follow these steps and everything will be working fine. Okay, so now we've done that, we can actually get on with the video. Now, a lot of you watching this will probably already know that dependency injection is pretty much the way to go. The only issue with it is that if you're working on a large project like we are, and let's say you have 200 different classes all requiring various dependencies, what if, say, you want to update the dependency of a single class? Well, your code is going to break unless you go through all of your existing files, looking for every instantiation of that class and updating the actual dependency, which is going to be a nightmare, let's face it. So the way that we remedy this is by using an inversion of control container, or IOC for short. And Laravel has a really powerful one. And what I've done is I've tried to replicate the functionality of it without actually looking at the source code. So enough of the talking, let's get some coding done. So inside our source folder, we're going to create a new file, inside core, and this is going to be called container. We're going to namespace it framework core, and we're going to create the class container. So that's all we need to worry about for now. What we need to do in the meantime is create a test for it. Now, those of you who have already been studying unit testing will know that it's best practice to keep your source folder and your tests folder symmetrical. In other words, if our container file is in the core folder in our source folder, we need to do the same inside our tests directory. So we'll create a new folder called core, and inside here we'll create a new file called container test.php. So we don't need to namespace this, we just need to create a class called container test, and it's going to extend php unit framework test case. Perfect. So let's just create a really quick nonsense test something, and we're going to return this assert true. So we know that this is going to pass. Inside our VM, we're going to run php unit vendor Mr. Terry H framework tests core container test. Hit enter, and actually let's just apply colors to this just to make things a bit more readable. So php unit -- colors, and to make this a bit easier you might want to look at creating a php unit XML file, which we may be looking at in the future, but for now this will work fine. And perfect, we get one test and one assertion. So let's get rid of that. What we actually want to do is create a setup method, and all we're going to do is create a new container instance. So this container equals new framework core container, and we'll create that property up here. Now we're actually going to get an error if we run this because we haven't actually included this file. So to remedy this, what we're going to do is require the and then we're going to jump back a couple of directories, and then we're going to require vendor autoload. And I've probably got that wrong, but let's test it. Yes, I have. Okay, so let's jump back another one. And great, okay, that's fine. So now let's just create a quick test. Test container is container. This is pretty pointless, but just to give you a rough idea of what we're trying to accomplish. So what we're going to do is say this assert instance of, and what we need to do for our first parameter is provide the full class name. That includes the namespace. So framework call container, and then we pass in the actual object. Okay, so let's give this a whirl. We'll run that, and okay, still didn't work. Let's try this instead. Now this is actually not very good practice, but we'll fix that later. For now, let's just get this working. Let's try one more time. Okay, so it looks like we've got two different versions running. So if we run PHP unit version, okay, so we're running 4.3.5, and in our files we're running 4.1. So let's update that to 4.3, and we'll run composer update. Okay, now that's done. Let's try this test one final time, and perfect, we get green. Now we can continue with the rest of the testing. Okay, so that test was pretty pointless, so let's get rid of that for now. And we're going to write some actual tests now. So the way that the container works is we're going to allow ourselves to bind objects to the container. So before we actually create the bind method, we need to test that it works. So public function test binding object works. And all we're going to do is say this container bind, and we're going to bind foo to bar. And then what we're going to do is return this assert equals bar this container get binding foo. Now obviously if we run this, we're going to get errors galore, call to undefined method. So let's fix that. We're going to say public function bind. We're going to take key value. We're also going to say public function get binding, and we're going to take a key, and we'll also create a bindings object, which will be an array. Now these undefined method errors are going to disappear now, but we're still going to get an error. Well, not an error, we're going to get a failure, because this method here isn't returning what we're expecting. So let's actually add the functionality now. So in this bind method, all we're going to do is set this bindings key equals to value. And in this, all we're going to do is return this bindings key. And I also want to just do a quick check to make sure that the binding exists. So we're just going to say here, if not array key exists, key, this bindings, we're going to return null. Okay, so let's try that test again, and we're getting a pass. So for the sake of drilling this into our heads, let's make sure that this returns null when we try to retrieve a non-existing binding. So public function test, what should we call this? Returns null when binding not found. So we're not going to bind anything like we did here. All we're going to do is assert null this container get binding, and we'll call it bar. So let's run that, and now we're getting 2 tests and 2 assertions. Perfect. So obviously the main purpose of the container is to resolve objects. In other words, instantiate a class. So let's create a new test called test resolve class returns object. And to do this, we're going to create 2 kind of fake classes. So we're going to have class foo and class bar. Now inside bar, we're going to create a dependency. So public function construct, and we're going to take this foo class that we just created. Now in this class, we're going to say this container bind bar to bar. And in fact, we don't actually have to do that because the container, once we've actually coded it, will be smart enough to know that that is a class. So all we need to do is assert instance of. This takes two parameters. Parameter 1 is the expected object, or the name of the expected object, which in this case is bar. And the second parameter is the actual object that we're testing. So let's assign that to object, and we'll say object equals this container resolve bar. And we'll capitalize that B. And just here we're going to make a quick change just to increase readability, like so. So let's make sure this works. We know it isn't going to work until we've actually coded it. Undefined method resolve. Okay, so let's fix that. Public function resolve key. And we're also going to accept arguments. So array args, except this is going to be optional. So we'll set that to an array by default. And for now, let's just echo key. So let's run this test. We're going to get a fail, but somewhere there should be key. Here we go. So we're getting that bar that we passed through in our test. So this is the complicated part. The first thing that we want to do is determine whether the binding exists. And if it does, we want to actually use the binding. So the first thing that we want to do here is check if a binding exists. And if it doesn't, we're just going to use the key that the developer passed through. Because in this case, we're actually passing through the name of the class, not the binding, if that makes sense. So we're going to say binding equals this get binding key. And actually, we'll rename that to class. So class equals this get binding key. And if class equals null, we're just going to set class to key. Okay. So now what we need to do is build the class. In other words, we need to create a reflection class and check whether the class has a constructor. If it does, we're going to go through all of the constructor dependencies and resolve each one of them recursively. If that didn't make any sense, apologies, but don't worry, we're going to be demonstrating it now. So instead of make one long resolve method, we're going to say return this build object, and we're going to pass in the class name. We're going to change this up a little bit later on, but for now we're going to keep things as minimal as possible. So public function build object, and let's just change the visibility to protected since no outside class is going to be accessing this. So build object class name, and we're also going to take the args. So we'll pass those through as well. So in here, the first thing that we want to do is create a reflection class. So we'll say reflector equals new reflection class, class name, and we need to use reflection class because it's not in the framework core namespace. And once that's done, we need to make a quick check. If we pass through the name of an interface here, we can't exactly check the constructor for dependencies because an interface doesn't have dependencies, obviously. So we're going to just check that the class is instantiable. Reflection class makes this really easy. So if reflector is instantiable, and I hope I spelled that right. No, that's a T. If it isn't instantiable, we're going to throw an exception. And let's just create that exception now. What should we call this? Class is not instantiable exception.php. Create that quickly. Namespace framework core class is not instantiable exception. and that's going to extend the default PHP exception. So we can get rid of that now. So if the reflector is not instantiable, we're going to throw new class is not instantiable exception, and we're just going to put in a quick message, class name is not a resolvable dependency. Okay, so once we've done that, what we want to do is resolve the dependencies in the constructor. But before we do that, we need to check that the class actually has a constructor. So again, reflection class makes this really simple for us. What we're going to do is say if reflector get constructor does not equal null, and inside here is where we're going to put all of our logic. First thing we're going to do is get the constructor and assign it to a variable. So constructor equals reflector get constructor. Then we're going to say dependencies equals constructor get parameters. Now what we're going to do is loop through these dependencies. So for each dependencies as dependency. And for now, let's just echo the name of it. So let's run this test. Okay, we're getting an error. Class bar is not a resolvable dependency. So that's this here. Oh, this should be if reflector is not instantiable. So let's try again. And what's the problem now? Oh, okay. Let's just comment that out for now. Try one more time. And there we go. Parameter 0 foo, which is this. Perfect. So let's just clear that. The first couple of things we have to do is check whether the dependency is optional. So that's really simple. If dependency is optional, then continue with the loop. We also want to make sure that the dependency is not an array. So if dependency is array, continue. So if we got this far, then the dependency needs to be resolved and injected into the object. So the first thing to do is get the class name. So class equals dependency get class, and that'll work fine, except for one thing. The problem now is that the dependency could exist, but it might not be a class. It might just be something like name, and it doesn't have a type int in front of it. So if that's the case, we can't do anything about it. So we'll just say if class equals null, continue, and we'll triple equal that. The next thing that we need to do is check if the class is requesting an instance of this container class. So if get class this equals class name, then we're just going to pass in using array unshift to args this, and then we'll continue with the loop. So otherwise, we're just going to array unshift onto the args array, well, the class, but we need to resolve it obviously. So this resolve class name. And once that's all done, we can just say object equals reflector new instance args, pass in the arguments, and then return object. If you're not familiar with the reflection class, all this does is it creates a new instance of the class, passing in the arguments provided. So let's uncomment this line and hope for the best. And miraculously, somehow this worked first time. Now the last thing that I want to do before we wrap up this lesson is in my application class, I want to inherit that container. So let's just make sure that we haven't broken anything in the browser, hit refresh, and perfect.